World War II ended in 1945, but the consequences of the Nazi regime extended far beyond the German surrender. While the leaders of the Third Reich faced the Nuremberg tribunals or fled to remote refuges, their wives, lovers, and romantic companions had to confront an uncertain fate in a devastated Europe. These women, who had lived in luxury and power during the years of Nazism, suddenly found themselves in a vulnerable position, marked by their association with some of the most hated men in history. The story of these women is complex and varied. Some were active accomplices of the regime, others victims of circumstances, and many found themselves in a grey area where survival became their primary concern. Their post-war destinies reveal not only the personal consequences of the Nazi collapse, but also the social and political tensions of post-war Germany. Eva Braun, the ultimate loyalty. Eva Braun, Adolf Hitler's best-known companion, never had to face the consequences of defeat. Her decision to remain with Hitler in the Chancellery bunker during the war's final days led to a tragic fate. After marrying Hitler on April 29, 1945, barely a day before their deaths, Eva chose to follow her husband in suicide. Her story, however, allows us to understand the pattern of extreme loyalty that characterized many of these relationships. Eva Braun's family had to deal with the consequences of this association for decades. Her sister, Gretel, married to SS General Hermann Fegelein, who was executed by Hitler days before the war's end, managed to survive and rebuild her life in post-war Germany. Eva's parents, Fritz and Franziska Braun, faced constant interrogations from the Allies and the social stigma of being Hitler's in-laws. Magda Goebbels. Ideological fanaticism. Magda Goebbels, wife of propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, represents one of the most extreme cases of ideological fanaticism. Magda was not only a fervent Hitler follower before marrying Goebbels, but actively participated in party events and became a public figure of the regime. Her decision to poison her 6 children in Hitler's bunker before committing suicide with her husband on May 1, 1945, shows the extent to which Nazi indoctrination had penetrated her psyche. Magda's story is particularly revealing because she had been previously married to Günter Quandt, a German industrialist, and had a son from that relationship, Harold Quandt, who survived by serving as a paratrooper in the Luftwaffe. Harold was captured by the Allies and survived the war, but had to carry the burden of being Goebbels' stepson throughout his life. Emmy Goering, survival and reinvention. Emmy Goering, wife of Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering, had a very different fate. Emmy, who had been a theatre actress before marrying Goering in 1935, managed to survive the war and face the legal consequences of her association with the Nazi regime. She was arrested by Allied forces in May 1945 and spent several years in various internment camps. During her captivity, Emmy was subjected to extensive interrogations about her husband's activities and her knowledge of Nazi crimes. Her testimony revealed interesting aspects about the private lives of Nazi leaders and the regime's internal tensions. Emmy consistently claimed she was unaware of the atrocities committed by the regime, although Allied investigators found evidence that she had participated in events where looted artwork was displayed. After her release in 1948, Emmy Goering attempted to rebuild her life in post-war Germany. Her daughter, Edda, born in 1938, had been Goering's pride, whom he considered his heir. Emmy fought for years to recover part of the family fortune, which had been confiscated by the Allies, and to clear her name of accusations of complicity with the regime. Emmy's experience reveals the difficulties many Nazi leaders' wives faced in reintegrating into German society. Despite her attempts to distance herself from the Nazi past, Emmy could never completely escape her association with Hermann Goering. She wrote her memoirs in 1967, titled My Life with Goering, where she attempted to present a humanized version of her husband and minimize her knowledge of the regime's crimes. Lena Heydrich, the architect's widow. Lena Heydrich, widow of Reinhard Heydrich, the architect of the final solution, faced a particularly complex fate. After her husband's assassination in Prague in 1942, Lena became a symbolic figure for Nazi propaganda. Hitler ordered that she be granted a generous pension and that her children be educated in the Reich's best schools. When the war ended, Lena was arrested by Czechoslovak forces and later transferred to the Western Allies. Her case was complicated because, Although she had not directly participated in her husband's crimes, she had been a direct beneficiary of his position and had publicly expressed her support for the Nazi regime. Lena spent several years in prison and internment camps before being released in 1948. Lena Heydrich's later life was marked by controversy. She settled in a small German town where she tried to live anonymously, but was periodically discovered by journalists and Nazi hunters. In several later interviews, Lena showed a defiant attitude, refusing to condemn her husband's actions and maintaining that he had simply been a soldier following orders. Lena Heydrich's children had to grow up bearing the weight of being descendants of one of the Holocaust's architects. Her eldest son, Klaus, became a respected engineer and changed his surname to escape family notoriety. Her daughter Silke managed to establish a successful career in business, but always maintained a low profile due to her family heritage. Margaret Himmler, the nurse's burden. Margaret Himmler, wife of Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler, presents another fascinating case of adaptation to post-war life. Margaret, a nurse who had married Himmler in 1928, had been a relatively discreet figure during the Nazi regime years. Her husband maintained an extramarital relationship with his secretary, Hedwig Potthast, who bore him 2 children, but Margaret remained officially as the SS leader's wife. When Himmler was captured by the Allies in May 1945 and committed suicide using a cyanide capsule, Margaret found herself in a precarious position. She was arrested along with her daughter Gudrun, who was then 16 years old, and spent several years in Allied internment camps. During this period, Margaret was subjected to extensive interrogations about her husband's activities and her knowledge of SS crimes. Margaret's daughter, Gudrun Himmler, became a controversial figure in post-war Germany. Unlike other descendants of Nazi leaders who tried to distance themselves from their parents' past, Gudrun maintained unwavering loyalty to her father's memory. After her release, she became actively involved in neo-Nazi organizations and dedicated her life to attempting to rehabilitate Heinrich Himmler's image. Margaret, for her part, attempted to lead a more discreet life. After her release, she settled in a small German town where she worked as a nurse until her retirement. However, she could never completely escape her past and was regularly contacted by researchers and historians interested in obtaining information about Himmler's private life. Hedwig Potthast, the Secretary's Dilemma. The case of Hedwig Potthast, Himmler's mistress, adds another dimension to this story. Hedwig had begun working as Himmler's secretary in 1936 and gradually became his romantic companion. They had 2 children together, Helga, born in 1942, and Nanette, born in 1944. Himmler officially maintained Hedwig and his children in a separate house, visiting them regularly. After the war, Hedwig was arrested by Allied forces and faced a unique dilemma. As a single mother of 2 small children and without financial resources, she had to depend on help from charitable organizations and the post-war German government. Her association with Himmler marked her for life, but her situation as a mistress, rather than official wife, provided her with a certain degree of distance from the Nazi regime. Hedwig's children grew up knowing who their father was, but attempted to lead normal lives. Helga became a successful businessman, while Nanette worked in the health sector. Both maintained a low profile and rarely spoke publicly about their family heritage. Ilse Hess, the prisoner's wife. Ilse Hess, wife of Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess, faced a unique situation due to the special circumstances of her husband's imprisonment. When Hess flew to Scotland in 1941 on his strange peace mission, Ilse was left in Germany not knowing if her husband would return. After the war, when Hess was sentenced to life imprisonment at the Nuremberg trials, Ilse became a prisoner of war's wife. During the 46 years Hess spent in Spandau prison, Ilse maintained a constant campaign to achieve his release. She wrote letters to world leaders, organized press campaigns, and became a public figure in the cause of her husband's liberation. Her unwavering dedication to Rudolf Hess made her a controversial figure, as many saw her as an apologist for the Nazi regime. Ilse managed to maintain certain social respectability due to the perception that her husband had been more a confused idealist than a war criminal. However, her refusal to condemn the Nazi regime and her insistence that her husband had been treated unjustly kept her at the center of controversy for decades. Her son, Wolf Rudiger Hess, became a successful architect but also an active defender of his father's memory. After Rudolf Hess's death in 1987, Wolf continued his mother's campaign to clear the family name and promote the version that his father had been a political prisoner. Gerda Bormann, the Believer's Tragedy. Gerda Bormann, wife of Martin Bormann, Hitler's powerful private secretary, faced a particularly difficult fate. Gerda had been a convinced Nazi before marrying Bormann in 1929 and had given birth to 10 children during their marriage. Her correspondence with her husband, which survived the war, reveals a deeply indoctrinated woman who fully shared Nazi ideology. When the war ended, Gerda found herself in a desperate situation. Her husband had disappeared during the fall of Berlin and was presumed dead, although his body was not found until 1972. Gerda was arrested by Allied forces and subjected to extensive interrogations about her husband's activities and her knowledge of Nazi crimes. Gerda's situation was complicated by the fact that she had 10 minor children who depended on her. The Allies faced the dilemma of what to do with such a large family, especially considering that the children had been raised in an environment of extreme Nazi indoctrination. Gerda was interned in several prisoner camps, and her children were distributed among different institutions and foster families. After her release in 1948, Gerda attempted to reunite her family and rebuild her life. However, extreme poverty and social stigma made this extremely difficult. Gerda died in 1946, only 1 year after the war, in circumstances suggesting she never managed to adapt to the new reality. Gerda Bormann's children had varied fates. Some managed to establish successful careers and lead normal lives, while others struggled for decades with the psychological consequences of their upbringing and their father's notoriety. Several of them changed their names to escape association with Martin Bormann. The mistresses and secondary figures. The story of Nazi leaders' mistresses adds another complex dimension to this narrative. Many of the high-ranking officials maintained extramarital relationships that were known but tolerated within the Nazi power circle. These women, who were often actresses, secretaries, or members of high society, found themselves in a particularly vulnerable position after the war. Actress Lida Barova, who had a famous affair with Joseph Goebbels, managed to survive the war and continue her career in Czechoslovak cinema. Her relationship with Goebbels had caused a scandal in 1938, when Hitler ordered the affair to end to avoid damaging the regime's image. After the war, Lida was arrested by Czechoslovak authorities and spent several years in prison before being released and allowed to continue her acting career. The case of Renate Müller, another German actress who had relationships with several Nazi leaders, ended in tragedy when she committed suicide in 1937, apparently due to pressure from her political associations. Her death became a symbol of the pressures faced by women in the Nazi power circle. The struggle for survival. The wives of mid-level Nazi regime officers faced similar challenges, but often with fewer resources to confront them. Many of these women had enjoyed elevated social status during the regime years, but found themselves living in poverty after the war. Their husbands were dead, imprisoned, or in flight, and they had to fend for themselves in a society that viewed them with suspicion. Denazification, the process implemented by the Allies to eliminate Nazi influence from German society, particularly affected these women. Many were classified as followers or beneficiaries of the Nazi regime, which limited their employment opportunities and subjected them to social restrictions. The denazification process required them to complete extensive questionnaires about their activities during the war and their degree of participation in the Nazi regime. The economic situation of these women was particularly precarious. Many had depended completely on their husband's income and social position, and found themselves without job skills or financial resources after the war. The German pension system did not recognize years of Nazi service, so many of these women had no right to government pensions. International perspectives and policies. The post-war international community developed a complex perspective on these women. On one hand, there was recognition that many had been victims of circumstances and indoctrination. On the other hand, there was an understanding that some had been active participants or beneficiaries of the Nazi regime. This ambiguity was reflected in denazification policies, which attempted to distinguish between different levels of culpability. The children of these women faced particular challenges in post-war Germany. Raised in an environment of extreme Nazi indoctrination, they had to adapt to a society that completely rejected the values with which they had been raised. Many of these children experienced profound identity crises and had difficulty forming their own political and moral opinions. The post-war German educational system implemented special programs to help these children adapt to democratic values. However, the process was complicated by the fact that many of their parents continued to maintain Nazi beliefs, creating a conflict between what they learned at school and what they heard at home. Psychological and social consequences. The psychological consequences of living as a Nazi war criminal's family member were profound and lasting. Many of these women experienced depression, anxiety, and other mental disorders as a result of war, trauma, and loss of social status. Persistent social stigma made it difficult for them to form new relationships or fully integrate into post-war German society. Historical documentation about these women is often incomplete or biased. Many of them refused to speak publicly about their experiences, while others provided testimonies that clearly minimized their knowledge or participation in Nazi crimes. Historians have had to rely on secondary sources, official documents, and third-party testimonies to reconstruct their stories. Cultural representation of these women in literature, film, and media has evolved significantly over the decades. Early representations tended to portray them as innocent victims or one-dimensional villains. More recent representations have attempted to present a more nuanced view that recognizes the complexity of their situations and the different ways they responded to the extraordinary circumstances of war. Historical significance and legacy. The impact of these stories extends far beyond the individual lives of these women. Their experiences reveal important aspects about the nature of the Nazi regime, civilian complicity in war crimes, and the challenges of reconciliation and justice in the post-war period. They also highlight the ways in which gender and social class influenced war and post-war experiences. Recent academic research has begun to examine these stories with greater depth and sophistication. Historians have recognized that understanding these women's experiences is crucial for fully comprehending the nature of the Nazi regime and its long-term consequences. This research has revealed the importance of examining not only male leaders and perpetrators, but also the women who were connected to the regime in various ways. The question of moral and legal responsibility of these women remains a subject of academic and public debate. While some clearly participated actively in the regime's crimes or consciously benefited from them, others appear to have been genuinely unaware of the magnitude of the atrocities or to have been coerced into participation. This complexity reflects the broader challenges of assigning responsibility in totalitarian regimes. Contemporary relevance. The lessons from these stories remain relevant in the contemporary world. These women's experiences provide valuable information about how societies can be co-opted by authoritarian regimes, how individuals navigate situations of extreme moral compromise, and how societies can work toward reconciliation and justice after periods of mass atrocity. The legacy of these women also extends to their descendants, many of whom have had to deal with the consequences of their family inheritances for decades. Some have chosen the path of reconciliation and public recognition of their ancestors' crimes, while others have maintained loyalty to their family members' memory. These different responses reveal the continuing complexity of dealing with the Nazi regime's legacy. Documentation and preservation of these stories has been an important challenge for historians and archivists. Many of these women destroyed personal documents or refused to cooperate with researchers, fearing legal or social consequences. However, the historical importance of their experiences has motivated continued efforts to collect and preserve available information. Archival sources and research. Government archives of Allied countries contain extensive records of interrogations, investigations, and legal proceedings related to these women. These documents provide an invaluable source of information about their experiences during and after the war. However, these records also reflect the biases and limitations of investigators of the time. Contemporary research on these women has been facilitated by the opening of previously classified archives and the development of new historical research methodologies. Historians now have access to a broader range of sources and can apply more sophisticated theoretical frameworks to analyze their experiences. International comparison of these women's experiences with those of wives and companions of leaders in other totalitarian regimes has provided additional perspectives on their stories. These comparisons reveal both common patterns and significant differences in the ways women associated with authoritarian regimes experience war and post-war periods. Gender and the Nazi regime. The study of these women has also contributed to a broader understanding of women's role in the Nazi regime. Traditionally, historical research had focused on the regime's male leaders, but attention to women's experiences has revealed the complex ways they participated in, resisted, or were victimized by the Nazi system. The question of justice and reconciliation regarding these women remains complex. While some were prosecuted and punished for their associations with the Nazi regime, others never faced formal legal consequences. This disparity in treatment reflects the complexities of implementing justice in the post-war period. Human rights organizations and Holocaust victim groups have expressed diverse opinions about how these women should be remembered and judged. Some argue they deserve the same condemnation as their husbands and companions, while others emphasize the importance of recognizing the complex ways gender and coercion influence their experiences. Educational and cultural impact. Holocaust and World War II education has begun to include more discussion about these women's experiences. Educators have recognized that understanding their stories is important for providing a complete understanding of the Nazi regime and its consequences. However, teaching about these women requires sensitivity and sophistication to avoid oversimplifying their complex experiences. Psychological research on intergenerational trauma has examined the ways these women's experiences affected their children and grandchildren. These studies have revealed complex patterns of trauma transmission and have contributed to a broader understanding of war and persecution's long-term consequences. Representation of these women in popular media has evolved considerably over the decades. Early representations tended to be sensationalistic or simplistic, but more recent representations have attempted to address the complexity of their experiences with greater sophistication and nuance. Continuing debates and future research. Public debate about these women continues to generate controversy and discussion. Their stories raise fundamental questions about individual responsibility, civilian complicity, justice, and reconciliation that remain relevant in the contemporary world. The way societies choose to remember and judge these women reflects broader values and priorities about historical memory and justice. Future research on these women will likely benefit from new sources of information, improved research methodologies, and more sophisticated theoretical frameworks. As the last witnesses of this historical period pass away, the importance of documenting and preserving these stories becomes even more critical. The implications of these stories for contemporary understanding of authoritarianism and resistance are significant. These women's experiences provide valuable information about how totalitarian regimes affect families and communities, and how individuals navigate situations of extreme moral compromise. Collective memory of these women remains controversial and subject to continuous interpretations and reinterpretations. The way their stories are remembered and transmitted to future generations will be crucial for maintaining historical memory and preventing the repetition of similar atrocities.